Okay, so what we're going to do today is we are going to now go back in history, way back to Genesis. So open your Bibles to Genesis, and we are going to go back and we're going to start looking at Canaanite beginnings, all right? So your Bibles are out. Ask questions at any time. This is going to be much more interactive tonight. And you've got the word Canaan here in Genesis, the 9th chapter, occurring for the first time. And what's happened in Genesis 9 that is not so good for Canaan? Do you remember what happened? Canaan was cursed. Did he do anything wrong? According to our Bible's account there. No, who did it? Ham did, his father. Okay, and if you really want to curse a man back in those days, you don't curse him, you curse the son. That is the worst thing that can basically happen to you. And so this is what happens. What's interesting about this, someone read Genesis 9, 24 and 25 real loudly, because we hope we're going to get it on this over here. Who wants to do that for us?
When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants. He shall be to his brothers."
Okay, so he says right there that he's going to be a servant of servants, and there's going to be a curse that happens. What's interesting is that you fast forward in history and you get to Solomon's time period, and he did a big, massive building program and did it with forced labor, and guess who he used? All the leftover Canaanites who were still in the land that all of the people did not dispossess. He did not force the Israelites into that slave labor, but he did conscript them into doing other labor, but they were not doing the hard labor like slaves. And so this is the curse that happens to Canaan here. Now, go a little bit further and look at Genesis 10, 15 through 19, and you're going to see a listing of very important peoples here, okay? So if you're reading this in Genesis 10, beginning at verse 19, Canaan became the father of Sidon. Now, Sidon becomes later on a Phoenician city, and it has a sister city. Does anybody remember the sister city, which later on took the greater glory of the city? That's Tyre, and it mentions several times in the Bible. Sidon, not so much. The worst character, or the worst queen in Israelite history, however, came from Sidon. Do you remember her name? Married, yes, Jezebel. Okay, she came from Sidon. All right, so Canaan becomes the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, all right, Heth is going to be the father of the Hethites or Hittites, okay? And then the Jebusites, we're going to find out later on, end up in the Jerusalem area in a city called Jebus, all right? And it was earlier called Salem when Melchizedek visited it, and that same area was later on taken by Jebusites. And then you've got Jeru or Jebu Salem, and it's called Jerusalem during the time that David takes it by his commander and then makes that the capital city of Israel during the kingdom. So the Jebusites are important people of that time period. The Amorite were in the area of Mesopotamia originally, and then this is according to secular history, they migrated by the Fertile Crescent around to the area of Canaan, okay? And remember, Canaan is also the land area of the Canaanites. And then you've got the Girgashite, the Hivite, the Arkite, the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zamorite, and the Hamathite, and afterward the families of the Canaanite were spread abroad. And then he says the territory of the Canaanite extended from Sidon as you go toward Gerar, as far as Gaza. And so Sidon is at the north, and then Gaza's at the south as you go toward Sodom and Gomorrah, which is to the east, and Admah and Zeboim, and as far as Lasha. And then he talks about the sons of Ham etc., and their individuals. So we have the Canaanites. Now, what's interesting about, any questions, by the way, first of all, before we go? This is just a map of during the time period of the invasion. This is kind of what it looked like, okay? Now, you see one area of this land area in yellow. That's the Philistines. The Philistines are not Canaanites. They are from what history calls the sea peoples. They are related to people that were seagoing people that came into the land and were quite adept at fighting battles and were very warlike. Those same sea people were probably the same ones that came down and were called Hyksos, or foreign invaders, by the Egyptians and invaded Egypt and took over the dynasties for a time period, of which I think Joseph was there and ascending to the vizier period of time while he was in Egypt, okay? So the Philistines are not true Canaanites in that sense, all right? But they are in the area of Canaan, and they were probably the arch enemies of the Israelites for quite some time. All right, so here's the major events in Canaanite history. We're going to have a double slide here, and I'm just going to kind of go through this as quickly as possible. If you have any questions, raise your hand. The first thing I want you to understand, though, is that as I grew up, go, Joel. This is from secular history and some joined with biblical history, okay? The first thing that I want you to understand is that as I was growing up, I thought of the Canaanites as very backward people that weren't very organized and had no influence on secular history. That's absolutely not true, okay? That is very, very false, okay? So this will help you understand how valuable they were in our secular history, okay? First of all, in about 2750 BC, you got the founding of Tyre. And you say, well, why not tell us about Sidon? Because Sidon becomes kind of a sister city-state. It's in the north, above Tyre, so it's at the northern end of what would be the Canaanite area, as the Bible tells us here. But Tyre becomes the most important of those, or the more important of those two cities, okay? And so you have the founding of the Phoenicians, who were a seagoing people, okay? We're going to mention more about them later on because they've got a god in Tyre and Sidon that's going to be introduced into ancient Israelite history that is supremely devastating to Israelite history. 2000 BC, the Phoenician alphabet invented. It's borrowed. That same alphabet is borrowed by the Greeks. The Greeks did a job on it. The Romans later on did a job on it, and we still have it to this day in some form. So they are responsible for the predecessor of our alphabet. The Syro-Phoenician alphabet is supposed to be the alphabet that is basically used almost everywhere. Now, where did the Phoenicians get it? Most likely from looking at the Egyptian alphabet, because they first had hieroglyphs, which was not an alphabet, but they began to move into a type of cursive Egyptian later on. And it was more alphabetical, and so they probably borrowed it from them, but then they did a great job. And it's not unusual at all that the Phoenicians developed an alphabet. They were trading all the time. They had to keep a record of their trades. And so that's where most alphabets are coming from. Cuneiform, the first cuneiform writings that we have in Mesopotamia, that particular writing is not so much alphabetical, it's character-like, but that started, the first or the earliest that we find are business transactions. They had to keep things straight. Okay, so they had to write them down somehow in those clay tablets. Okay, next one. The Amorites migrate 1745 BC from Mesopotamia to Canaan, and they kind of live on the east side of Jordan. Then there's the development of their own alphabet. The Canaanites had their own alphabet separate from the Phoenician alphabet, which was later on borrowed by the Greeks. Both seagoing people and both trading people all over the eastern Mediterranean. Somewhere between 1250 and 1200 is probably the Israelite invasion, even though scholars dispute again and again and again whether it's 1500 or sometime in 1300 or to this time. The reason why I choose this time period is because it coincides with archaeological digs that show widespread destruction that happened in Canaanite areas during that time period. So building of the temple, and then he begins sending out amazing trading expeditions. Now those trading expeditions go all over the Mediterranean and go as far as Tarshish. They're responsible. So this makes the Canaanites responsible for Phoenicia, and Phoenicia is responsible for Tarshish colonies, and those are the earliest beginnings of Spanish. That's Spain. That's where who wanted to go to run away from God? As Jonah. He was getting in a Phoenician boat. It's not unusual that he was going to go to Tarshish. He was out of there, going all the way to the other end of the Mediterranean. Okay, so that's extremely important that they had those kinds of ties to Spain, because you're going to learn about that more later on. And then in 860 BC, you've got Jezebel, a princess of Tyre. She marries King Ahab. Now, why would Ahab marry? With all the women in northern Israel during this divided kingdom time, why would he marry someone like Jezebel? And she becomes so prominent. Why would that happen? Power. That's right. Alliances. You marry for power. Especially a king will do that. Solomon later on is going to do it when he marries an Egyptian princess. Okay? So this is very important. And what's, of course, tragic about this is that she introduces what is called Baal worship to Israel at that time. And she brings down her own priest. Okay? And we're going to learn a little bit more about that. More events. In 813, Carthage, and I'll show you where that is on a map in just a moment. Carthage, a colony of Tyre, is founded. That's in northern Africa. Okay, Carthage is a city-state which will become so important in history that it almost changes the history of the world, okay, because of what it does during some wars. And so that, again, is a Canaanite sister city. Tyre is then going to go through a time period where the Lord is going to pronounce judgments against it, and it's going to have wave after wave after wave of invaders coming to it. By the time Tyre is a city that's just beleaguered by wars, Carthage is become a power in the Western Mediterranean. Okay, so we'll learn about that a little bit more. 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar begins his 13-year besieging of Tyre. This is recorded by Nebuchadnezzar. It's found in cuneiform writing because he, remember, is from Mesopotamia. So the Babylonians and the Assyrians all use this cuneiform type of writing. It is found there that he did a 13-year besieging. He says that they finally capitulate. That's probably the best writing in history of what happened. He wasn't able to destroy the city because Tyre was not only the city on the mainland, it was also, they had a citadel on a rocky island just about 3/4 of a mile off the coast of that Levant area, okay? And so they would go over there and use their powerful navy to blockade, and then they could go back and forth, get all of the supplies they wanted. It was almost impossible for them to do anything, but Nebuchadnezzar brought them to their knees after a 13-year besieging, and he's the first to start scraping the city and throwing it around the area. He was so angry at what happened, he was able to take the city on the land, and he began to scrape it and throw it out into the sea. Somebody else does that job a little later on. 332 BC, Tyre is besieged by Alexander the Great. He comes careening, Alexander the Great comes careening through that area of the Levant. And as he goes through, he wins his first battle against Persia, against Darius, and then against Xerxes. And as he comes down through this area, he goes against Tyre. And Tyre just basically did the same thing they had done years and years before with Nebuchadnezzar. They went out and kind of hunkered down on the island. But Alexander the Great was just, I mean, his battle plan and his way of dealing with things, he was a genius. And so he scraped the rest of the city off, began to add to what Nebuchadnezzar had done. And by the way, that area was for the drawing of nets. And if you go look at Ezekiel 26, 7 through 14, that's what the prophecy against them is. You're going to be a place for fishermen to dry the nets. Alexander makes a causeway all the way across from the mainland to the island, besieges the citadel out there, and takes the city completely. He didn't use his navy to do it. He didn't have to. So that was a remarkable plan that he had that brought Tyre down. And if you read Ezekiel 26, 4 through 5, and Ezekiel 26, 7 through 14, which we don't have a lot of time to read about tonight, you'll see how those prophecies came true. Now, after Tyre falls apart, their city-state now is beginning to really, really wane in historical significance, but not the historical significance of the Phoenicians, who are now on the other side. Basically, they're growing in power in Carthage in North Africa. And they begin to grow in that power over to Sicily, which is in between North Africa and Italy, and then to the west around past the Strait of Gibraltar up into Tarshish or Spain. And they're putting city-states all along there, which Phoenicia has already started early on many years ago. And so the First Punic War begins against Carthage, between Carthage and Rome. Rome is the Western power that has already taken Italy. Okay? Carthage is the North African power, and they're both seagoing people that like to trade. They want the Western Mediterranean trade. So they begin to fight over Sicily. And it's amazing to me that the Romans were able, this just shows their brilliance, that they were able to win a sea battle against the Carthaginians, because they definitely had the better navy. But the Romans came up with the crow. And it is an amazing invention that they put on the front of their ships. And it's just basically a massive spike that's just up like this. And the Romans thought, what do we do well? We do hand-to-hand combat well. So we're not going to fight too well in a sea battle. So let's just come up beside the enemy ship, drop the crow down, hold the enemy ship there. It has a gangplank. They run over and kill everybody on the other ship. And that's how they defeated Carthage in the First Punic War, and Rome got Sicily. And Carthage said, okay, we're just going to expand our empire up into Spain. Well, as they began to do that, Rome kept saying, we don't want you to do this, we don't want you to do this. And there was some treaty at the end of Sicily that kept saying that the Carthaginians couldn't do what they wanted, but they began to create a massive empire. And as they did that, they came into their Second Punic War. By the way, the word Punic is the Roman or Latin word for Punici. Doesn't it sound like Italian? Bonici. Okay? And that is the word for Phoenicia. Okay? So they knew they were Phoenicians. They knew they were the descendants of the Phoenicians. So they call it First Punic War, Second Punic War. A brilliant general, and this just about changed history, got an amazing army, went through North Africa, went over to Spain, went over the Alps with his army, and elephants, which is an amazing feat, and came from for a while he disappeared, and all of the Romans didn't know where he was, and they kept thinking it's going to be an invasion anywhere in the Italian island by sea. They just thought somehow he has been able to hide himself out at sea. And then he comes down from the north on land, and he won every single battle that he fought against the Romans. The Romans were wild with craziness. He even surrounded Rome, but he knew he couldn't take that city, so he just went careening through the Italian peninsula and just destroying everything. The Romans were panicked. They sent out 2 new generals with 80,000 in their army. That's the largest Roman army ever to meet a foe in the history of the Roman Empire. Not even what was brought against Jerusalem was as large as 80,000. And they battled them at the Battle of Cannae, and Hannibal had the better battle plan. He literally took his army and went out stretched like this and allowed the Romans to come in, and then took what was called the first pincher move that we ever hear of in battle plans in history, surrounded them and took the very thing away from the Romans that they did so well, the ability to do hand-to-hand combat by their infantry. He squished them so much that they were shoulder to shoulder. They could not maneuver. They could not do anything. And it was the worst slaughter of any army just about in the history of mankind. About 70,000 of them went down. Roman soldiers were creating holes in the ground, sticking their heads in it, and suffocating themselves so they didn't have to be killed by the Carthaginians. So with this great battle, Carthage still loses the Second Punic War, because Hannibal cannot have the decisive victory. And then Rome empties their treasuries, and Numidia begins attacking Carthage in northern Africa. So Hannibal is called back home. He has to come back home, and in the land battle there, he loses. And he loses his life running for his life. So the Second Punic War goes Rome's way after a horrific time period. Then Rome decides one more time they're done with Carthage. They imposed upon them some horrible rules, and they finally said, move your city from a seaport city. Well, the Carthaginians just said, no, we're not going to do that. So this time, it was almost genocide. In fact, I would consider it such. Carthage was besieged by Rome. They did not have the allies to fight against Rome. After 2 years, Rome destroyed the city, slaughtered people from house to house, every single one of them, except for the ones that they crucified afterward, and then sowed the entire city with brine, with salt, so it would never again be built. It was just awful. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the end of any Canaanite history that we know about. So their legacy is with us, but that was it. Here is, right here you'll see, I'll turn around this way so you can see there's Tyre, here's the Phoenician states, and there's Sidon, modern-day Beirut, and Byblos, which, by the way, what do we get from Byblos? The Bible. All right, the word Bible, not the Bible itself, the word Bible, because they were the first to use scrolls, all right, in that little area. Okay, so that's where you have these Phoenician city-states up here. You have the kingdom of Israel, and you have the kingdom of Judah right here, and this is after, of course, Solomon's time period and the division. And then you've got Ammon over here, which is going to be important in just a moment, and you've got the Philistines down over here, okay? So you have the Tyre and Sidon. And then this is the great Phoenician city-state, and this was their empire. Whoops, I hit the wrong button. Let me see if I can go back. Wait, come here. There we go, okay. So you have Carthage right here. See how close it is to Sicily? And so that was their first Punic War. Second Punic War is when Hannibal went around here, all the way up over and invaded from the north and was right there at Rome's gate immediately, okay? And then the Third Punic War happened right here at Carthage, where they destroyed the city. Rome later on built that city and built it into a very nice seaport, but it was off the original site because they brined it so much they couldn't grow anything on it. So they had to do it off the site. Okay, so that's kind of the end of Canaanite history. That takes you all the way from Ham, the father of Canaan, and takes you up to that time period. We'll now look at these Canaanite gods. There are two gods that are especially heinous in Israelite history. One of them is Baal, and that's the little fertility god that you see right there. Baal's actual name in the language means ruler, lord, and master, okay? And it was a Phoenician storm and fertility god joined together. Since they were seagoing people, they really had to have a god to control the seas, okay? And their fertility god was the thing that got Israel into so much trouble. Because basically, following after this god meant following after having sexual relations with priests and priestesses. Okay, and so that was an abomination to the Lord. Now, the other god is not coming from the Phoenicians, but is coming from the Ammonites. Who remembers who Ammon was and how he had his beginning? You got Moab and Ammon, and they're twins. Who remembers? That's Lot's sons. Remember when he got drunk and then had relations with both, they're not twins, both of his daughters, and they're born about the same time. Okay, so you've got Moab and Ammon, the Ammonite god, is a god called Molech. That's one of the gods, and that god's literal meaning is king. So to go after a god that says master and lord, and after a god that says I'm the king, and that it was Molech as the one who is often stated in history as having its hands outstretched like this, and that means I want a sacrifice. And the sacrifices that were often given to Molech were not only animals, but people's babies, people's children. In fact, of the things that they've excavated in ancient Carthage or modern-day site of Carthage, the gruesome things that they have found are the funerary areas where there are just baby bones one after another all over the place for their sacrificial system. So they learned it. Sidon and Tyre learned this kind of god type of thing with Baal and with Molech, and these were the downfall of the people. Interesting. Let's go to a couple of passages here. Turn over. Someone get 2 Chronicles 28:3. Who wants to get that? Okay, Joel's got that. Who wants to get 2 Chronicles 33:6? 33:6. Okay, Dan's got that. And then Jeremiah 7:30-31. Who's got that? Jeremiah 7:30-31. Okay, Roger's got that. Let's just read those one after another, okay?
He burned incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burned his children in the fire according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord has cast out before the children of Israel.
Okay. What's the valley of Hinnom? What's another word for that in the New Testament? Who remembers? That's Gehenna, a word for hell that Jesus used, because there were fires burning there continually in that valley. Okay? That's Ahaz. That's Ahaz the king. Now, Manasseh does this in chapter 33:6. Who wants to read that? Who's got it? Okay, Dan.
He made his sons pass through the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom, and he practiced witchcraft, used divination, practiced sorcery, and dealt with mediums and spiritualists. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger.
Okay. So you got the same valley being used again later on in the history. Ahaz comes before Manasseh, and this is going on again, chronicling these kings here at this time. Now, look at I'll just read you 1 Kings 11:7, because this is during Solomon's time. I don't remember this when I was studying about Solomon as a kid, but this is what is stated. Then Solomon built a high place for Shemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Solomon is the one who starts that this kind of Molech worship on the east side. And he's appeasing all of these wives that are coming from different areas that he is actually marrying in order to basically cement his legacy in history. Well, of course, it does the opposite, because the prophet comes to Solomon and say, let me tell you what's going to happen, not in your lifetime, but the kingdom is going to be rent away from you and given to one of your servants. And that servant was Jeroboam. So that's a really rough time period. All right, now we're going to go back. Remember the sons of Heth, okay? They were original Canaanites, weren't they? Okay, and they are the originators of the Hittites. So we still haven't gotten done with Canaanite history, basically. Now we're going to go to Hittite history. Now, it wasn't until around 1830s that someone finally excavated and found the Hittite archaeological dig area. In fact, before that time, it was of some rebuke by scholars and by those who read the Bible, saying the Bible must be making Hittites up. You know, the first mention that we have of Hittites is the sons of Heth sold a cave for whose burial? You remember? Yeah, it was whose? I'm sorry, I can't hear. Sarah, thank you. It was Sarah's burial. All right, Abraham bought a cave. Well, he tried to buy a cave, but he was such a wonderful man that the son of Heth said, you are such a great man, I am not selling you this. I will give you this, and you can bury all of your relatives in this cave. So that's the first mention we have of somebody of the Hittites being in the land. So they were in the land during Abraham's time. Okay, later on, we have a Hittite mentioned. Did I hit that again? Okay, we have a Hittite mentioned when it comes to Esau. He married a Hittite woman. How did that go with Isaac and Rebekah? That was like the worst thing that ever happened. The Bible is so clear about that. It said it made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah to have that Hittite woman in their tents. Okay, so that was pretty bad. Obviously, they weren't worshiping the same God. Okay, and then finally you have a very noble Hittite who was Uriah the Hittite. Remember him? And that was David's commander. And David, of course, had him murdered, basically, because he had had relations with his wife, Bathsheba, and she became pregnant. And he wanted to make it look like, that it was Uriah. And so he had him murdered. And so there, again, you have a Hittite. But you don't have any, when you excavate, when you dig into the Levant area, you don't find any Hittite writings and all of this kind of stuff. Someone finally found the center of their empire, and it's in Turkey, or what was called Anatolia in that time period. So the sons of Heth migrated up north, and then they founded this amazing empire which rivaled the Mesopotamian empires that were going on during its time period. And if you'll notice there, this is happening in 1340 BC. So this is happening during a time that the Egyptian empire is going south and up into that land period as well. So the fact that the Hittites are in the land when the Israelites come there, and part of the land inheritance is what they have there, is not unusual at all, because they are growing and have an empire in about 1350, and they have outposts all along this area trying to exert their influence into Canaan, whereas Egypt is trying to exert its influence. And Rusty already mentioned the battle, the major battle that the Egyptian Pharaoh had against the Hittite king, and they both claimed a great victory because we have the recording of each. And so this is happening during that time period. What did the Hittites give the world? Well, once again, this Canaanite contribution is amazing. They are responsible for iron smelting. So they bring the Bronze Age to an end, and they create the first iron chariots. And I cannot imagine the first iron-tipped arrows. I cannot imagine going into battle the first time having bronze shields against iron-tipped arrows. It would go through them. Can you imagine holding up a shield and then all of a sudden having an arrow go through it and just strike you right in the head? You know, it must have been a very scary thing. So this iron smelting that they were able to do and all sorts of metalworking basically took the entire world out of the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, and that's huge in history. To say that the Canaanites were an irrelevant people in history is to say a very, very bad statement, because the two things that we have from them today are the alphabet and iron. Okay? Who had a question? Yes.
I think I missed something. You started by saying that there was little evidence of the Hittites, and that was a cause for. So when was this discovered?
In about 1837, I believe it is, they discovered the Hittite massive, massive area of all of their writings. They adopted a cuneiform type writing, and so they're all over the place. That's how they know about, well, Josephus was the one who stated that the Hittites also started iron, and they also they find the iron smelting there, and they've gone back and dated it. They find the iron type of, what would you call it? The areas where they did the iron smelting, which looks different than what you would do, and there are great iron ore deposits up there. David was the one who brought the kingdom of Israel into Iron Age, because he conquered south of Edom, and there were rich iron ore deposits in that area. So then, you remember who were the only two during David's time that had weapons that were made of iron? You remember? Yeah, Saul and Jonathan. Saul and Jonathan had those weapons, and the rest of the Israelites did not have that kind of weaponry, but the Philistines did. The Egyptians, the Philistines, and the Hittites were all those that were first with the iron smelting, and they kept it a guarded secret. They didn't want anybody else to know about it for obvious reasons, because it militarily made a difference. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, let's move on then. We're going from the Hittite Empire and all of the Carthaginian Empire and all of the Canaanite influence. We finally get to what we have as an old Babylonian empire. Now, this is kind of interesting, because after the Akkadian Empire falls, then there's a period of time where they're just back to city-states. But then a very, very skillful ruler comes to the throne in Babylon. And that's earlier Babel, that's mentioned in Genesis the 10th chapter, okay, in this great city-state. And this is Hammurabi. And almost every sixth grader will at least know, if they know nothing about history, they will remember Hammurabi. Okay, this king was great because, and the world knows about him, because during this time period, he wrote 282 laws and put them on a stela or stela, okay? So you see this right here. This right here is the head of the stela, and this is the great Babylonian god Marduk. And the king, Hammurabi, is receiving the 282 law code from him. This is the earliest written law code that we know of and have a record of. Okay? And by the way, this right here, this obelisk, is actually mentioned or actually is in the Louvre today, so you can go and see it there. And this is probably Hammurabi's likeness. Probably. We don't know for sure. Okay, so this is amazing here. Now, what's interesting about the 282 laws, let me read you one here. This is law number 196. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. Law number 197. If he break another man's bone, his bone shall be broken. There we go. 198. No, not 198. 200. If a man knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. Now, how does that sound familiar to you? That's an eye for an eye. We call that eye for eye and tooth for tooth laws. Okay, when does Moses write that? Somewhere around 1500 BC. Okay? And when does Hammurabi have it written? somewhere in 1750. Which comes first? The 1750 BC. Okay, I didn't put BC up there, excuse me. All right, and so the question is, well, did Moses actually copy laws from the Babylonian time period over here? Not at all. Not at all. What is obvious is that, remember that God always dealt with the Gentiles in earlier times. They had laws, and God was dealing with them at all times. Excuse me, I can't speak. Melchizedek, okay, is not an Israelite. He's before that time. God's working through him. Jethro is a priest of Midian and a priest of God, and he's not an Israelite, and God's working through him. Okay, the fact that people had law at that time was obvious. God held them accountable to that law. Paul tells us that. The eye for eye and tooth for tooth type laws that are mentioned in the Old Testament and mentioned here, and also mentioned in Hittite laws, were to protect people from being killed because they broke somebody's tooth. I will take you out for breaking my tooth, dude. You knocked out my eye, you are going down and dying. No. Hammurabi says, I did this for justice. He even writes in this, we've got it translated, he even writes, I have done it to protect the weak. So you wouldn't get any more. If you hit somebody and knocked out their eye, you knew what was going to happen to you, but no more could. And if you knocked out their teeth, one tooth's coming out, or how many ever you knocked out. You weren't going to die for it, okay? So those laws were done in order to protect the people, and that's the way Hammurabi viewed it. I believe those laws were there for a long, long time. You remember the violence that happened before Noah's time, or during, and right before Noah's time, and then the afterward time period where God says, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. I'm going to issue laws, and governments are going to be imposing laws upon people so that we're not going to have this kind of violence, okay? And it's going to be, they're going to take the blood of somebody if they shed the blood of somebody, okay? So this blood for blood and eye for eye and tooth for tooth type stuff is in the law of God. It's just that Moses wrote it down. It's just that Hammurabi wrote it down. It was a law of the ancients. There's no way Moses would have known about Hammurabi's law code, probably at all. It just didn't get from that point to the other. He knows about this kind of law code because it's the law of the land. I don't think anybody that read Moses' law or heard Moses' law was like, wow, that's new. Eye for eye and tooth for tooth, bone for bone. No. They probably thought, yeah, that's what we've always been doing. And some of these people out here end up killing somebody for a broken bone. No, that's not going to be done anymore. Okay, this is a great empire, and Hammurabi's a really, really good king. Okay, and he changes the world by law coding things, and people begin to do that over and over and over again. Even Assyrian rulers had law codes like this, even though they were pretty rotten. Any questions?